Hello all, Auntie Tear here! In 1949, American University professor Joseph Campbell published a book called The Hero with a Thousand Faces. In it, he claimed that there was a universal story that people repeatedly have told in every culture, which points toward a single psychological need that humans have. He called this the monomyth, and breaks down what the story looks like and how to interpret the steps of the cycle, which he identifies as the hero's journey. The popularity of the journey skyrocketed starting in the late 70s with Star Wars. In examining the monomyth and its impact on Star Wars, Noah Caldwell-Gervais produced a video essay linked below. In it, he says this.
Ultimately, that's my big problem with Joseph Campbell's monomyth, with George Lucas's Force, that they are intended as compassionately universalist solutions to complex and thorny issues of human morality, cognition, and communication, but end up shaving down and polishing off elements of the human experience I find extremely exciting, extremely valuable. I think even Joseph Campbell would agree that the thrill of a story is to discover something outside of yourself that feels transformatively magical. If the monomyth was completely wrong or off base, it would not be one of the foundational pillars of modern popular culture. Yet, the fact that the hero's journey and all its 17 unifying steps lurks behind so much of the art that fills our world means we are confronted at every turn by rhyming stories, narratives assembled with the same enthusiasm and craft as a Katy Perry single. And for the same artistic aim. The monomyth is an earworm. Get it out in front of people standing in line at the supermarket and they will unconsciously start swaying their hips.
Now, Captain Caldwell-Gervais addresses a lot of criticisms of the character and effect of Joseph Campbell's essay, and I think it's important to do that. Yeah, but it's not enough. So, in this essay, we're going to criticize the foundations of the monomyth and deduce how it can be true when we criticize the monomyth because it fails to account for broad swaths of our culture, but the monomyth still quite obviously describes a certain type of story we do see in history. So, let's go. Part 1. The monomyth, the monomyth myth, and the monomyth myth myth. Okay, so what you won't find in any discussion of the monomyth and the hero's journey in almost any place is an account of the lineage of ideas which lead to Joseph Campbell's essay. Rather than a journey, let's take a brief trip. So let's start with Freud, the founder of modern psychiatry, whose ideas have been influential and discredited in equal measure. He gets a lot of credit for introducing a modern model of mind, and for introducing dream analysis, both of which had actually entered Europe through discussions with Native Americans during the Enlightenment. So he was just credited for making them bourgeois enough for the psychiatric community's patrons to accept. Read Thou Shalt Not Be Aware, Society's Betrayal of the Child for more details on this. The main form of contribution that Freud made in this discourse was to come up with the idea of the subconscious, an unconscious part of yourself that makes decisions based off instincts and desires. Psychology generally finds little use in this discourse nowadays, and Freud remains relevant mostly as a suite of metaphors used in literary criticism. But Freud wasn't immediately discredited, and as discourses tend to do, psychoanalysis mutated in order to try to explain the inconsistencies in its approach. Following World War I, Freud's intellectual successor, Carl Jung, began to try to use the legacy of psychoanalysis he had inherited to try and adapt Freud's opus to do the job that sociology was literally just founded to do. He extended Freudian concepts into what I fully and wholeheartedly describe as mystical. Criticism of Jung's work has produced a lot of important material for understanding reactionary mysticism and esoteric fascism, but the facet of his work that I want to most specifically focus on is the collective unconscious. This concept is pretty simple, if fully bourgeois in execution. The collective unconscious claims there is a connection that people have to all other people, collectively. It goes on to claim that despite the pressure a connection like this would have, people don't perceive or consciously control it, and therefore this collective connection is not conscious. Within this liminal space we share, we find commonalities of our experiences that seem to resonate similarly throughout time and place. Water is life but sea is danger, women as erotic object, old man as arbiter of morality and master of skill, some kind of tree of life. Jung described these as archetypes, literally a type above the others. This is important for Campbell because it allows an interpretation of archetypes as a result of the collective unconscious, which lets them supersede the actual text of the work being read. Jung and his acolytes wielded the concept of the collective unconscious to explain why all of Europe went to war twice, why populist politics was so effective during this period, and why Hobbesian approaches to politics are generally desirable. Hobbes famously describes society as a war of all against all, until we get a kind, just, and godly king, which is a story as ahistorical as it is loved by reactionaries. I'm not sure if you can sense my criticality already, but let's go into the lightning round. This concept is bourgeois because it absolves the people in the state who make decisions from the responsibility of those decisions, from the debt they owe to society from the harm those decisions cause. The sin of those decisions is placed instead on the masses, the faceless multitude which you can project anything onto. It also creates a conception for collective decision-making which leaves it permanently out of reach of the masses. Next is the fact that it has a built-in way to discredit anyone who denies some claim made by the proponents of collective unconsciousness. Any opponent who says, well, I don't feel that way, you can just be called a naive neophyte for failing to understand the concept, or be told you're taking it out of context. The most damning point, though, obviously, is that it's unfalsifiable, because whatever the material conditions may be, you can blame the behavior of society at large on this collective unconscious. Marie Antoinette says let them eat brioche, and the guillotines come out, not because the people have been failed by the system and are demanding one which does better by them with the tools of the system that came before them, but because of the effects of some mystical archetypes on their psyche which they had no control over. Absolute fucking sophistry. And that's the last point which I want to cover, because collective unconsciousness as a concept fails to account for any kind of material critique. Without those critiques which show Jung's failing, the concept does seem quite compelling, and many people took it quite seriously, and still do as they cry over their beef meal about the plight of white men. But it is at this point that we thankfully move out of the realm of goopy psychiatry and into the blessedly sterile realm of philosophical anthropology? So, let's go over the hero's journey. The monomyth was established in the philosophical text Hero with a Thousand Faces, which was published initially in 1949. To break down the argument of the book to its simplest form, storytelling has tended toward a certain archetype of story in which a hero hears the call to journey, meets his mentor, passes into a realm which is closer to the divine, where he does a bunch of, adventure stuff. He gets his ass kicked and finally learns what it means to be a hero. He wins the day and comes home with a solution to the initial quest, usually alive. Quite commonly, the end of the story is actually the hero ascending to kingship or godhood, or even joining the forces of nature itself, like a constellation. Campbell views this form of story as particularly resonant among humans because of how we respond to the collective unconscious. As I said, Jung's ideological tools require you to view your fellow humans with hostility and distrust, a cue which Campbell gladly runs with. He imagines that the masses yearn for their chains, and as most people who critique the monomyth note, the monomyth flattens the expression of narrative art into being the hero's journey, or maybe just a side story which clarifies some aspect of the hero's journey to the audience, and as such, it enforces that distrustful, traumatized post-war spirit onto human nature itself. So, people who are critical of the concept of a monomyth tend to think of it as a myth about myths, a monomyth myth, if you will, and they levy criticisms which Noah Caldwell-Gervais' video goes over in great detail, but I think those criticisms aren't enough. So let's see if we can create an intellectual toolset that supersedes the criticisms that the monomyth myth makes claims to. Which is a funny claim to make here at the cusp of elaborating the monomyth myth, because this is where we break from Campbell's hero's journey from a moment. I mentioned in my religion discourse video that anthropology uses the concept of the psychic unity of humanity to explain how humans on planet Earth have a limited number of environments, with a limited number of social pressures, the 3 Fs, and a predictable range of resource scarcities. So, the pressures of their environments affect the designs of their technology, both social and material, and those designs follow predictable routes. There might be thousands of species of tree to make wood from, but most wood behaves in predictable ways. And most soil can be shoveled, and most rocks can be quarried, and most metals can be hammered. So, tools which do certain jobs develop in similar ways. It is important to note in this conception that social structures are just complex tools where people can mutually use one another to accomplish our goals. And the way those structures develop is based on the incentive structures they put into place. For more about the incentive structures in question, check out my video on the Bronze Age collapse, or the one about conspiracies. The concept of psychic unity also explains why so many religious buildings scattered across the earth are either dirt mounds or stepped pyramids. The technology and techniques which we use to make differently shaped buildings are very dependent on the materials which are available, but if you only have dirt, you make mounds. If you have stone, mud, or clay in excess, you'll also be able to make stepped pyramids. But I'm starting to get away from the point. Psychic unity of humanity is of interest to us because it is the other half, the material half of the equation which Jung was missing. It accomplishes all the things that the collective unconscious fails at. It leaves room to hold those at the head of states accountable for their violence. It leaves agency for action in the hands of the previously faceless masses by allowing them the freedom to change the social structures they live under and thereby change the incentives of those social systems. It gives space for people in different environments to be able to understand each other without the need for ambassadors and judges to handle justice for us. Campbell's tunnel vision on an unreachable collective essence to these myths could never help us understand the way the societies of the world have been shaped by our myths. But seeing our world as an ecology of societies interacting with each other and the world, to consciously decide on how to shape our stories, gives us clarity which can guide us away from our chains. And so if we take the analysis that Campbell did from the starting point of collective unconscious and run the same process through our psychic unity discourse machine, we find something interesting. Part 2. The caring labor of telling stories. Okay, so something interesting happens to your psyche when you exist within a state. You live in a world where some person with unilateral access to overwhelming violence can come in and turn your world to fear and pain at a moment's notice. It isn't okay. It's trauma and horror, even in the best of cases. So you need to invent or discover a reason why it is okay, allowable, permissible, ignorable, or normal. If you don't have that reason, then every abuse that you hear about, every problem caused by the doers of violence, every imposition on your life by the class which directs that violence, in our case the white capitalist ruling class of the United States, becomes a reason to resist them. Even if it's just a tiny act of resistance, a tiny bit of solidarity, or even a little malicious compliance, as a treat. The violent statists, their supporters, and the masses in our society need some reason that it's okay enough to continue living like that. And so the reason why it's okay comes in the form of narrative metaphor. A story which puts an ideal in your head, where even if the violence of real life is wrong, there is a right kind of violence, and a right kind of person who can be trusted to do the right kind of violence. It's kinda dark, but when you take the screws out and open up the case, this is trivially and obviously true. Most of the things that a protagonist in a hero's journey does are plainly criminal to our modern standards, to the point where a common meme is to call the hero's party murder hobos, or to dryly observe that some hero ransacks a village, not unlike the raiders you would expect them to protect the village from. To make the next step we're going to take make sense, we need to get something straight about history, though. There has never been a successful hereditary monarchy in history. And whether you call them dictators or kings, every monarch has eventually had an heir who was deposed, whether by the people or by another dynasty. Stars above, the vast majority of monarchs don't even successfully get to a third generation before they either get conquered or couped. But that's not all. States, on the whole, are unstoppable, as the only states which haven't collapsed or been conquered are the ones that are still in progress. But this isn't what you'll be familiar with if you're a fan of history or political science. The narrative that we are taught of history pretends to show the great actions of great men, but that isn't what is present in history. What we see is the desperate and violent actions of terrified men clinging to powers which they did not create, which they do not comprehend, which they can hardly control. We see them clashing with each other, conquering and enslaving their neighbors, and pushing the bounds of cruelty as far as they can on their own people until the blowback happens. Usually, it is in the form of an explosive release of aggression from the conquered peoples, often starting in societies on the periphery of these cruel gangster organizations which we call states. Sometimes this explosion collapses the state, which locally ends the cycle, but throughout written history, the violent reaction turns into a conquering force, usually forming the next state to collapse from the ruins of the old, like sociopathic hermit crabs. An empire for an empire leaves the whole world barren. And this goes into my point from the History of Christianity video, where I talk about the French Revolution using the guillotine on Louis XIII and Marie Antoinette in public executions, because the French royalty had been using the guillotine since it was produced and doing public executions for a very, very long time. When the revolution comes, it follows the character of the society which forms it, and those societies have narratives which justify them. So, did you catch it? Yeah, exactly. Always present and invisible in historical discourses which so wholly focus on the great men are the great masses. For almost all of history, there's been a push and pull between elements of society, between the masses who do the caring labor which makes the society run, and those who compel that labor not through a reciprocal responsibility of care, but through applied violence. The fasces is a perfect example of this. The sticks and the axe are given glorious focus in the image and the metaphor, but the fastener holding it all together is the caring labor of the string, erased from your imagination. The hands which do the works of these so-called great men of history are the soldiers first, who fight against the enemies of the king. But an army requires nearly 100 people doing caring labor for every soldier in the field. Though, again, that labor is hidden by calling those jobs support roles. Indeed, the historical role of armies is mystified by what we are taught, because those armies acted as police before police forces were established. Because the people of a nation are the primary enemies of the head of state. This is true because a state's ability to compel caring labor is directly dependent on its ability to pacify the caring class through applied violence, including psychic violence, hence the patriarchy. Even I can admit, in a gross way, that the division of soldieries into army and police was an elegant sleight of hand, a divine misdirection which reinforces the function of the soldiery from doing the violence of the state against the king's enemies, because it effaces their duty to enforce against the people he lays claim to who might not want to be claimed, and allows the ruling class to pretend the army only exists to do violence to their foreign enemies. The modern police forces were self-admittedly founded to do violence to us, the caring class, and justice was an afterthought. I mean, you can't call yourself moral if you dismiss this kind of behavior. And at this point, it's important to note that kingship, especially stranger kingship, is pretty ubiquitous. In On Kings by Graeber and Solons, Marshall Solons notes that if there is a ruling class, it becomes more stable if they can have an element of their ruling class claim to come from another land. Heck, even the American ruling class hails from Europe, and mostly from England and Germany. Not even Britain, England. Another important point is that kings are often seen as containers for the divine forces of the universe, which is why the president gets blamed for the economy, even though everyone knows it's capitalists who make choices completely separate from him that affects the economy. And there's so much to talk about with this subject, I can't recommend On Kings enough. So the point I'm trying to get to is that stories do the job of shaping social technologies and incentive structures. Not saying what happened, but saying what happened actually means. The job of creating and telling those stories is caring labor, and it is important to note that with reactionary ideologies which support statist aims, if the ideology only attracts men, it might survive. But if it can convert women, it can recruit their children too, because women tell so many stories to their kids and control how they spend their time. Okay, we've set up enough so that we can go back and speak about the monomyth myth. So, once more, into the goop. Part 3, the statist Stranger King mythscape. So, to review. The monomyth uses pseudoscience to claim that a certain habit of storytellers is imprinted on and inseparable from the human psyche. The monomyth myth points out that Campbell's approach to narratives flattens the parts of the stories which don't conform out of existence and is pretty American and conservative in character. The monomyth myth, which I'm elaborating here, is that the thing Campbell calls the monomyth exists, but its claim to unanimity fails the fucking vibe check. It is a specific aspect of humans' reaction to living in a society which, as I mentioned, can do unsurvivable violence to you for no reason at any time. So, I think that the big thing is that we have to rebrand the monomyth. So, from here on, I will call it the statist Stranger King myth, or the SSK myth. It is the product of a person who needs to believe that the status quo in the world is fine, that the problem with putting together a society in this shape is putting the right pieces in the right place. This conception presupposes that the right people can or could exist and that the system could be shaped in a way that consistently gives them access to power, or that failure to do so is somehow acceptable. This is the reason that so many heroes' journeys produced by our modern society are about someone in the role of a soldier or police officer, because it exists to create the idea that somebody could be so virtuous and special that their ability to levy violence is considered above reproach. But we don't live in a society where it is thought that the king is the source of the violence. All Americans, and most people who have access to this essay, grew up in a society which uncritically or critically reproduces this statist Stranger King myth. And so even when we produce stories which deeply criticize that state of affairs, those criticisms still operate within or as a reaction to that statist Stranger King myth. So, the concept that Joseph Campbell identified, the SSK myth itself, was an interesting identification, sure, but when he tried to claim that it was the only shape a myth could really come in, a shape which supersedes the stories themselves, and that it was the only story a people can try to tell, he fumbled the fucking ball, right? Because it is obvious that there is a contrary position, and slobbing on a king's royal regalia isn't the only way to interpret our relationship with a state. Everyone exists in a world that has relationships with unilateral access to violence, even people without states, since nature's violence is essentially random and unaccountable to us. This fact weighs on us and affects the ways we imagine the world, and the way we convey that idealized world to others. So, every human alive lives in a world of stories, which we can use not just to tell people what happened, but to agree or disagree with what happened means for the state of affairs we live in. So the reason it looked like a single myth to Joseph Campbell is because the stories which disagree with the status quo still live within an information landscape which we can call the SSK mythscape. One of the reasons it is necessary for a denial of the SSK myth to reproduce so many parts of it is because if an SSK myth shows us what it means to be a hero, a king, a god, then a story critical of this portrayal would need to set up the situations which measure kingship, godhood, and heroism, and show why those situations are not good in practice. But in setting them up, they still replicate the thing they criticize. They don't make the SSK myth, they live in the SSK mythscape. So let's look at those stories which so obviously couldn't be considered heroes' journeys, and generally don't get treated like action-adventure stories either. Comedies exist as a way to compare our expectations of situations with possibilities which generally fall outside those expectations. Comedy which punches up shows a critical lens to the myth, conveying the idea that the process of measuring a protagonist for heroism is absurd. A comedy which punches down will encourage compliance with those systems by putting a person who doesn't measure up and portray their flaws and failures as the real absurdity. Next, a tragedy approaches the same kind of situations, but comes to the conclusion that the measuring process is, well, tragic. If it is critical of the myth, it will show that a normal person with normal flaws can't possibly measure up, or show that the kinds of actions that potential heroes are asked to do are tragedies. If it is compliant with the SSK myth, it will show the tragedies caused by failing to measure up. Horror, on the other hand, is a genre which shows that the measurement is violence in and of itself. If it is critical, it will show the violence of the systems of control in our hierarchy and enact those violence of those systems in public view. If it is compliant, it will attempt to foist the violence onto a supernatural force or people who are victims of violence in the first place. The essay is too long at this point to go into a long aside about how horror is the most proletarian form of story, from scary stories we tell in the dark to pulp novels and B-movie horror. Horror is one of the most attainable genres for a person who started gaining wealth sometime after they were born. Anyway, none of that was to say that those genre interactions with the mythscape are inherently or consistently hypercritical of or dangerous to the status quo. They can often act as a catharsis for the audience who doesn't necessarily need to change to feel okay. They just need to know that they aren't the only people who feel that there is a problem. So, in adhering to most conceptions of genre, the reason a person gravitates toward a story is because we want to experience what kind of feelings that a story imparts, and the majority of people approach stories with the lenses they've been fed. Some critics do look at the kinds of themes that a story contends with, but rare is the critic who steps back to show what those themes take for granted and what they are in service of. So, as a critic, what's most important to me about stories, across genres, is the way they approach the SSK mythscape. If a story uncritically agrees with the power structures, if it wants to protect and reproduce them, then I find them to be reactionary. If the narratives believe that the power structures can be broken, but that a different approach to power could fix them, I call it liberal. And saying that is all well and good, but the next step is the reason I brought you here today, to talk about the antithesis of the statist Stranger King myth. Part 4. No kings, no masters. So, what happens when a story holds the general shape of the myth, but is highly critical in all the ways that I pointed out that other genres can be? What does it take to have a story which shows the absurdity of the measurement of kings and the tragedy it causes, shows the violence and the horror? It has time for romance and love, room for gods and heroes, but no patience for kingship. No reverence or respect for the power structures which grant the heroes their specialness, even going so far as to have enmity with the gods of the story. How could anyone really say that a story is monomything when it denies and decries the hero's journey at every level the authors could conceive of? How could Campbell's system even interpret a story which holds that if a system requires a sacrifice, it is an evil system, which points out that each lie, each coercion, each waste of time and life is a failure which leaves rotten all the successes of hierarchy, of capitalism, of kingship? Indeed, we find ourselves in a territory which is identifiable in Campbell's hero's journey, but which seems to defy and reject every assertion he makes about the unique and integral essence of the myth. So, the stories I'm talking about in this section interact with the steps of the hero's journey. They quite often get lumped in with the action-adventure genre, but they do not agree with the assumption of heroism that is core to the hero's journey. For example, the second step in Campbell's journey is called the refusal of the call. And the refusal gets met with a reprisal, which forces the hero onto the call. And for Campbell, this was a hedge to allow stories where the hero doesn't immediately hop on the train to Destiny City. But for us, we can see how it shapes the idea that the best kind of hero is a reluctant one. But in these anti-monomyth stories, there is no refusal proper. Instead, we can see that the refusal of the call is instead the first step. It is the call to adventure. But the call to adventure is transmuted from heroic to tragic. with the call itself being turned into violence. Or, in the very next step, the hero meets the mentor, and in this kind of story, they are either a rival, a turncoat, or something else, because they show the cursed incentives of their system. The point of the differences between the hero's journey and these stories is to funnel your emotional reasoning skill toward a certain conclusion in the same way that the standard SSK myth manipulates you. As a member of the audience, you've been trained to be part of the status quo, sure, but more than being part of the status quo, the SSK mythscape has taught you to root for the protagonists, even if they fight against the status quo of their world, often by making their goal to make the world a bit more like ours. So, to guide the emotional reasoning, this story begins to slowly but surely demand that the protagonist fights not just for themselves or their loved ones or the people of some country against their evil king, but they fight against the system which made both them and their enemies powerful, and the narrative ultimately funnels the character to tear down the system, even if that means dying in the process, even if it means unifying representatives from many different factions of society, or collectivizing society itself. This kind of story slowly funnels you towards supporting the hero, even if it means challenging and dethroning God itself. Because what these stories ultimately lean on is a technique as simple and obvious as the fact that out of the thousands of dynasties in written history, that only around 200 states are still kicking, and most of those are less than a generation old. The fact is that a god is simply any being which can change your reality through violence. And as Solons puts it in On Kings, there is a straightforward equivalence that king equals god. And as I've noted, Campbell asserts that hero equals king while effacing the king part of it. The hero equals being who has a sacred duty and a divine right. That a hero is a person who deserves whatever place in society they want, whose boots we should kiss. So, it must stand that in these stories, our protagonist is both an ideal and an antithesis to heroism. And it is here that I have a problem, because I want to call this trend the anti-hero's journey, because it goes against the hero's journey. But then, people will think I was talking about an anti-hero on a journey. And I don't want that. And, I kind of want to call it the anti-monomyth, but I just want to stop using the phrase monomyth so that we all stop repeating Campbell's patently false assertion to unanimity. So I'll call it the anarchic journey, a journey in which a person you would normally call the hero is instead called to do the anarchic work of shaping society for the people who live within it. So, since the concept has been just floating in the ether for a while, let's name a couple stories which I identify as following this trend. Berserk, Bartimaeus, Akumetsu, Three Body, Suikoden 2, Centaur World, Evangelion, Earthsea, Akira, Hunger Games, FMA, Black Company, Xenogears, Song of Ice and Fire, probably, Final Fantasy Tactics, the parts of Dune written exclusively by Frank Herbert, FF10, Player of Games by Ian M. Banks, Gurren Lagann, and Avatar The Last Airbender, but not Legend of Korra, I swear to fucking God, and much, much, much more! There are a lot of hallmarks which we can identify in these media, so let's start by putting them in a numbered and disordered list. Number 1. They have an attachment to horror. Whether showing disasters, murders, massacres, or leaning on horror imagery and tropes, these stories don't shy away from being disturbing to their viewers. 2. The characters are powerful in a world where their power doesn't preclude them from failure or trauma. Very often we see characters at the height of their power get maimed or killed, not just for the dramatic stakes, but in a way that drives home the position of violence in society. Speaking of that violence, 3. The stories steer themselves into speaking about the systems which give the characters of the story power, and usually they go into some detail to describe not just the magical system, like that narrative Coolbear and Brendan fucking Sanderson, that cultural fucking stripminder knows what he fucking did. Anyway, here are some examples. 3.1. Fullmetal Alchemist describes alchemy and the political structure of Amistris, as well as the geopolitics of the series. 3.2. Three-Body elaborates a theory of sci-fi technological advancement and of galactic politics and of human politics. 3.3. Berserk isn't afraid to show you the highs of Guts' heroism as a member of the first Band of the Hawk because it delves into how the leader, Griffith, got his position, the kinds of things he has to do to maintain it, and the kinds of things he's willing to do to increase it, and Guts' lack of ambition is what we're supposed to empathize with. Speaking of Griffith, 4. These stories always include characters or situations which allow the protagonists the ability to be compared to others who have different positions and relationships, but still mirror other parts. 4.1. Akira, for example, has Tetsuo and Kaneda as both being delinquent, Tetsuo and Akira both being espers, and Tetsuo and the General both being power-mad jackasses. 4.2. Final Fantasy X has Jecht to compare to Titus and Seymour to compare to Yuna, among many others. As this type of story becomes more common and our approach to producing stories become more polished on the whole, stories that are produced in this style will become even more proficient at these comparisons as we move forward. And we can see this is true because 4.3. Almost every character in Game of Thrones being used as a point of comparison to other characters, which ultimately paints a very unflattering picture of the character of hierarchies in general and feudal hierarchies in specific. And the reason why so many of these stories are horrific without being horror, and tragic without being tragedies, is because of the scale. Indeed, 5, often the tragedies in this narrative are so over the top that we can't really fail to notice the systemic issues which cause them, like Sho Tucker's infamous crime in Full Metal Alchemist, which was caused by the pressure put on him by the Führer. Sometimes the horror is turned out to an industrial level, like the production of demon soldiers by the Kushan in Berserk, or brought out of the domain of force majeure and placed back onto human systems of control, like the truth about sin and the Yevon religion in Final Fantasy X. And finally, the last feature I identified is number 6. At the conclusion of these stories, the systems which caused the status quo of the world have collapsed, and no character has assumed a role or kept a level of power which gave them control of a new status quo. It doesn't matter if that powerlessness is achieved by having used up, lost, destroyed, or eliminated access to the violence which made them so powerful, if they achieved a moment where they transmuted that access to violence into something distinctly non-violent, or simply if they died. This is the only feature of our budding narrative journey which is truly required, because the critique of the hero's journey is not complete unless the main character's access to divine violence has a terminus. And the reason why only feature number 6 is required is because all of the other tragedy and horror of these stories exists as a requiem to the violence that we all suffer, and the things I've identified aren't even individually required, but they are the common denominators that stuck out to me, which strengthen the reading. Leave a comment if you can think of other features which stories like this have, or other examples of this story. As the authors of these stories reach out to anyone who knows that pain, they find an audience who are in a position of social or material neglect. In fact, one of the reasons these stories are so compelling, often becoming cult hits, is that people do find and emotionally connect with them. We see the violence in our stories reflect the real violence we face, and see the criticisms levied at power and fundamentally agree with the critique, even if we never thought to bring the criticism into our conscious thoughts. One of the reasons this kind of story is so hard to recommend, though, is that it requires you to be willing to experience stories which depict the kinds of violence we face that we try to escape from. So, quite often, the kinds of people who are able to enjoy it at all aren't concerned with the morals or ethics that the series touch on, or they're not ready to investigate their attachment to those stories, or, in the worst case scenario, a person who approaches it can't get past the almost always violent, often sexual imagery. And this is why I love Centaur World so much, because it examines these intense themes in a way that was judged safe for ages 7 and up. And along with Avatar: The Last Airbender, the only examples I can think of which are both an all-ages television show and American. I know this because I scraped the shit out of the barrel to identify Anglophone media that are anti-monomyth. On the other hand, there are a fuck ton of Japanese ones, especially following the bubble economy bursting in 1991, gushing everyone's dreams out to sea. Despite the fact that I left a ton which belonged on here off the list for brevity, I also left a ton off which you might be tempted to add to the list. So, let's interrogate 2 questions about why a work might not belong on the list. 1. Well, if Berserk gets to be on the list, why doesn't One Piece? Because when we look at this critique of systems within narratives, we must turn to the reality of the situations in which the authors were living, which systems affected them, which systems benefited them. Very often, an artist will produce a piece of media which is ultimately ambiguous about whether it is critiquing all power or just certain systemic archetypes of the story. The reason it is ambiguous in the case of One Piece, but not Berserk, is because Japan is a place that has been colonized by the US since the end of World War II. This means that for some stories, we can't tell if they are critical of all power or just the power that the US uses to control Japanese politics. Berserk gets to be on the list because from the opening chapter, we're fighting against the nobility of each nation who claim to be on God's side in their megalomaniacal war of all against all. On the other hand, One Piece might be textually quite close to our reading of the anarchic journey, but the textual presence of the Navy as the bad guys makes it very difficult to discern whether or not they're dunking on all military enforced hierarchies and colonizations, or just the American one. So we have to figure out how they're going to roll out the story before we can make that call. So, a story maps onto real-life conflicts, but if it is too direct a comparison without addressing the contradictions in the conflicting systems presented, then it is hard to ultimately judge it as having this story paradigm. This remains the case even if the series didn't finish, because both Berserk and One Piece are unfinished, but Berserk's politics are obvious and undeniable from the start, and One Piece's politics may be a procedural result of an endless serialization. This shows that we can judge unfinished works, as with Frank Herbert's Dune, the GRRM saga, and Xenogears, but that a final end to the story allows us a much more definitive picture. Which brings us to our other question, number 2. If Evangelion gets to be on the list, why doesn't Shin Godzilla? Well, thanks for asking. Evangelion is so hopeless about the future of the system which empowered the creator to direct Evangelion, that Nerve's failure during the stories caused the exact outcome it was designed to prevent, not unlike the bubble economy. On the other hand, by the time of Shin Godzilla, the same creator, Hideaki Anno, and the Japanese economy had acclimated to life after the bubble. And Shin Godzilla views the inaction of the government against the oncoming storm of natural disasters to be a primary failure, and the kind of inaction could be fixed if only we put some unorthodox younger people in charge, which is, technically true, but it fails to interface with the systems which allowed them to fail upwards. Therefore, it demands fundamentally less detachment from the SSK myth than Evangelion did, showing that even if an author creates an anarchic journey, it does not become inherent to that creator's work. But a better question is, why do I think it is important enough to make an essay like this after Buffalo, after Uvalde, after the baby formula famine, after every failure of our system? Why am I focusing so much on reconstructing our approach to the caring and imaginative labor of myth-making? Part 5. Thou shalt not doubt thyself. So, our thoughts can be a lot of things, right? They can be images, sounds, concepts, words, emotions. Yeah, emotions are thoughts. And indeed, the edges of each kind of thought can bleed together. Concepts that have strong emotions directly attached to them, images which have words and phrases associated with them, and so on. Each of these types of thought can be understood as a type of pre-verbal or semi-verbal phrase, and the phrases of emotion are even more nuanced than just the words we have associated with our emotions. More than just angry, we can be spiteful, vindictive, surly, pissy, enraged, and much, much more. The difference in feeling and behavior are quite obvious, and this is because emotions are a way to respond to how we judge the status of our physical and social environments. And the phrases which are produced by our judgment are different, even if they aren't literally words. I know they're not words, obviously. But what emotions do for us is provide us with a broad, immediate biochemical reaction to the value judgments we make. These value judgments can have an incredible amount of depth to them, and some of our most nuanced emotional reasoning is just received as vibes, often described as some kind of gut feeling. And this is why the hero's journey is a useful tool for perpetuating a society which makes the SSK mythscape a necessity. I think we need to dissect and understand our relationship to this myth because of the way we interface with fictional narratives, or even historical ones, which become fiction as they are pared down for easy consumption. We interact with these stories and they tell us how to feel about situations facing our hero, who stands in for real-life heads of state, soldiers, and cops, and for ourself. It teaches us to identify with those people who would use violence against us. But we don't stop interfacing with the kinds of events that these stories deal with. We see bullying, and we see corruption and violence, murder, exploitation, aggression, theft, and so much more in both real life and in these stories. And so when people have an experience, they make those value judgments based on their past experiences, including the imagined past of a fictional narrative which was designed to be emotionally satisfying. So this means that as we interact with hero's journey after hero's journey, we are inculcated into a pattern of value judgments that expect us to uncritically suck off the hero as much as Joseph Campbell did. We get primed to experience other stories, including our lives, through a lens of unquestionable admiration, seeing those heads of state, soldiers, and police as some kind of bulwark against the destructive forces of the universe, the corruptive force of entropy itself, and most scary of all, the wild and undomesticated nature of humanity itself, including our own humanity. But if you remember, the thing I said about history is that these stories come together to be the big lie that gets repeated until you believe it, and it gets to be that without ever having to say that it's what it's doing. Indeed, these myths are quite appealing because humans are powerless in the face of the destructive violence of the universe, and of entropy itself beyond that, and the ways that humans behave under the incentive structure of a society which wants a hero is a society which disproportionately advantages the dishonest, the violent, and the cruel. The elegant sleight of hand of the SSK myth sells to you that it is the soldiers and police who enact that cruelty without ever protecting us from the universe or entropy. Outro. Joseph Campbell was seduced by the hero, far more than the people who recorded the stories he co-opted to elaborate his thesis. His love of their erotic potential makes him lose sight of why the ruling classes of so many societies decided to record and propagate the myths that he collated, because everything the ruling class does is obviously about keeping control or using that control to enjoy their lives at the cost of our bodies, and it has been that way for millennia. In Dawn of Everything, the Davids point out that historians, archaeologists, and anthropologists have a bad habit of interpreting things through the lens not just of the culture they're from, but from the particular position they hold in society. Campbell was a literature professor, specializing in classics, and he would obviously hold a reverent and religious place in his psychology for the hero, who he would view himself as a mentor for. But more than that, through Campbell's work, the concept of the story itself is both fenced into the exact version of the story that resonated most with Campbell's experience and desires, and reified to a previously unimaginable level. And indeed, Hero with a Thousand Faces became more true after it was written than it could have been before, with more works made since 1980 than all the works he chose across all of human history before it, and which follow his format more closely than any of the works he identified. And that process of becoming more true after a treatise is written has happened with countless other pieces of completely fucking detached statist fanfiction, such as The Wealth of Nations, The Prince, and The Turner Diaries. Either way, the claim that we're doomed to forget the story and retell it over and over again seems to have missed the mark, because instead, the journey has become a constantly applied salve to the conscience of the oppressed, who need to imagine that some king or some hero, somewhere or some when, could be the exact type of person who is good enough for the job, who deserves the job, and can execute it without executing us. But for the good of us all, maybe we need to start imagining a world where the only good hero is a dead hero. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to stay after the credits for the postscript section. If you liked the video, leave a like and a comment, share it out, check out our other videos, subscribe and hit the bell. If you like our content, give us a follow on Twitter and check out our Patreon, since videos like this couldn't be produced without the help of our patrons, like our ogres. Alyssa Herzog, Christine Fox, Donning Frost, Jacob Kleefkes, Kevin Young, Klarstrup, Nick Schverd, Non-Anonymous, The Nick of Time, Velu, and Wuku, our Gremba tier patron. Our art is made by the inimitable Grem, who you can find on Twitter at GremmasOnline, vivisecting the Sasquatch myth. Our music is made by Brent Endricken, who you can find on the YouTube channel, namesake to him, or deep in the throes of a tonic con law seizure. Our editor, Lady Susanna, refuses to get tested for invisibility, even though everyone knows. Postscript. We're going to do a guided meditation where we think of every failure of society during humanity's current lifetime, from around 120 years ago. Think of the dozens of genocides, the famines, the wars which were just defense contractor slush funds, the denial and defunding of our social programs, the debt slavery for medicine and education, the constant cycle of boom and bust and coercion and exploitation that leads to premature deaths and dismemberment, the deaths on the roads we are forced to travel, the deaths from preventable diseases, the flu, AIDS, COVID, the destruction of food produced by an unsustainable model, taking food out of the mouths of our children and grandchildren, all while slashing and burning forests to make room for cows whose meat and milk will just go to rot. The draining and despoiling of our water, and there's so much more than that, but it is so fucking awful and so overwhelming that we have a hard time handling it. It makes us angry, and it is the will of the capitalist oligarchs who like the world this way, no matter how many hundreds of millions of people have to die. So, let me read a quote from Steinbeck. "The works of the roots of the vines of the trees must be destroyed to keep up the price. And this is the saddest, bitterest thing of all. Carloads of oranges dumped on the ground. The people came for miles to take the fruit, but this could not be. How would they buy oranges at 20 cents a dozen if they could drive out and pick them up? And men with hoses squirt kerosene on the oranges, and they are angry at the crime, angry at the people who have come to take the fruit. 1 million people hungry, needing the fruit, and kerosene sprayed over the golden mountains. And the smell of rot fills the country. Burn coffee for fuel in ships, burn corn to keep warm, it makes a hot fire. Dump potatoes in the rivers and place guards along the banks to keep the hungry people from fishing them out. Slaughter the pigs and bury them and let the putrescence drip into the earth. There is a crime here that goes beyond denunciation. There is a sorrow here that weeping cannot symbolize. There is a failure here that topples all of our success. The fertile earth, the straight tree rose, the sturdy trunks and the ripe fruit, and children dying of pellagra must die because a profit cannot be taken from an orange. And coroners must fill in the certificate, died of malnutrition, because the food must rot, must be forced to rot. The people come with nets to fish for potatoes in the river, and the guards hold them back. They come in rattling cars to get the dumped oranges, but the kerosene is sprayed, and they stand still and watch the potatoes float by, listen to the screaming pigs being killed in a ditch and covered with quicklime, watch mountains of oranges slop down to a putrefying ooze, and in the eyes of the people there is a failure, and in the eyes of the hungry there is a growing wrath. In the souls of the people, the grapes of wrath are filling and growing heavy for the vintage. Okay, go look up a mutual aid group and hype them up on social media or something, I don't know. Thanks for watching, be safe out there. See you next time.